Well, a warm welcome to all of you. This is the official book launch for Church and State in Zambia, written by our speaker, Dr. Elias Munshya. I am the Director of Global Advocacy for the World Evangelical Alliance. I'm on the advisory board of the International Institute for Religious Freedom and executive editor of the International Journal for Religious Freedom. I've spent my working life focusing on issues related to church and state, mainly in Canada, but now more internationally. So this topic is of great interest to me. The International Institute for Religious Freedom was founded in 2007 to produce high-quality research on religious freedom. The IIRF has a global presence with academic and advisory partners on all continents. It performs original research in collaboration with partners. The IIRF is also a meeting place for all scholars that take an interest in religious freedom. The flagship publication of the IIRF is the International Journal for Religious Freedom. Published twice per year, it is a global peer-reviewed journal that solidly supports religious freedom for all. The IIRF also started publishing books in 2011. Church and State in Zambia is the 16th book published by the IIRF. I have long been involved with the Christian Legal Fellowship in Canada. My first job was as executive director of the CLF back in the early 1990s, and I've been to many of its conferences. One of the things it does well is to encourage Christian law students, including graduate students. So it is not surprising that I met our speaker at a CLF conference many years ago when he had his own law firm in Calgary whilst also working on his PhD. I was immediately impressed with such a well-educated dynamo. Let me introduce His Excellency to you. He has a BA in theology, a master's in leadership from the Global University. He has a master's in divinity from Ambrose University here in Canada. Then he embarked on a legal career with a Bachelor of Laws from Northumbria University. Then he completed an MA in counseling at Providence University College. He then did an MBA at the University of Wales and then went back to law with a master's in law from Northwestern University. Finally, he has completed a PhD in political theology at South African Theological Seminary. Throughout this time, Elias was also a pastor, and he spent 7 years working as a lawyer. He had his own law firm in Calgary, Alberta, Canada for 4 years. In June 2022, Elias was honored to be appointed Zambia's High Commissioner to Australia. In April 2023, he was additionally Zambia's High Commissioner to New Zealand. His Excellency is therefore joining us from down under in Canberra. When I saw that Elias had, he and I are connected on LinkedIn, as happens in professional relationships, I saw on LinkedIn that he had successfully completed his PhD with a thesis on church and state in Zambia, and I was immediately intrigued. I was aware that Zambia is officially a Christian nation. It was enshrined in the Constitution in 1996. One of the significant issues in religious freedom is the impact of having an official state religion. How does being a Christian nation impact church-state relations? Do churches have a special role in informing public policy? Now, the Zambian Constitution also says that religious freedom is protected and guaranteed. But how does this work in practice? This book explores these themes and identifies both positive and maybe some negative aspects and impacts of such a declaration. Of course, these things always have unintended consequences, and so there are certainly consequences on the church and the church community in Zambia. So I will turn it over to the author to explore some of these themes. So over to you, Dr. Munshya.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Janet. And thank you very much to all my colleagues here, that my fellow panelists. I would like also to thank the publisher for having considered my book worthy of appearing on your as one of the publications, one of the books, one of the 16 books. That is not to be taken very lightly, and so I pay a great tribute to all of you. Janet, we've come a long way, definitely, after having met many years ago, and I have also seen the quality of your work and the role that you have played in religious freedom in Canada, beginning with Trinity Western and all the issues that had to do with all those issues. But here we are. I am very grateful that we could finally have this book launched. And so regarding the long history of service, perhaps to theology, to politics, to history, and now to diplomacy, we could most probably add the fact that we have been published as an author, and so it's as a result of your great work, and I really appreciate that. A little bit of background about Zambia before I give the roadmap of the issues that the book explores. Zambia is right at the heart of Southern Africa, as we normally would want to refer. And so it is a former British protectorate. Now, that is just a fancy way of saying colony. And we got independence in 1964. And my book explores that history as well. So the good thing with this book is it explores not only theology, it also delves into history. After independence in 1964, the first Republican president is known as Kenneth David Kaunda. So in 1964, he becomes the first president. And in fact, these are the natural divisions of the book. So they are going by political era. So there is the Kenneth Kaunda era, and then there is the Frederick Chiluba era, and then the subsequent presidents. One of the things that happened in Zambia somewhere around 1991, when President Frederick Chiluba assumes the presidency, is he declares Zambia to be a Christian nation. So he gathered some believers at State House. And so when I'm using the word believers, I'm very mindful of the language here. So he gathered essentially evangelicals at State House, and he proclaimed Zambia to be a Christian nation. So that was in December 1991. That was a very significant event for many reasons. Nevertheless, it did not end there. At the time that the declaration was made in 1991, there was no legislative backing to the declaration. It was verbal. It was done in the context of a prayer, and there was no legislative consequences to the declaration. Nevertheless, in 1996, Zambia amended its constitution, and it then officially, in the preamble to the Constitution of Zambia, declared itself to be a Christian nation. And my book does highlight a particular quotation from the 1996 Constitution, the 1996 amendment to the Constitution, where it clearly says that Zambia is a Christian nation while affording each citizen's rights to religious liberty. After 1996, the Constitution of Zambia was again revised with the amendment in 2016, and the 2016 Constitution amendment also carries very similar language, and my book explores that. So in the context of a nation which has self-declared as a Christian nation. Now, what my book deals with is that it then goes back into history a little bit. So 1991 declaration of Zambia as a Christian nation is a historic fact that President Frederick Chiluba did. Nevertheless, the context of religion and politics and religious freedom we can't just go to 1991. We need to go back many years, and that's what the book explores. So it goes back to Kenneth Kaunda and the founding of the nation itself. Because even if President Kenneth Kaunda did not officially declare Zambia to be a Christian nation, he did refer to Zambia as a Christian nation. So his worldview was that Zambia is a Christian nation, and for some reason, Zambia had Christian the government of Zambia had some Christian backing or backing from God. And so we see that continued throughout Kenneth Kaunda's leadership. And so how then does the church relate to a state that has declared itself as a Christian nation? The issue was no longer about whether a state can be Christian, because that's what I noticed from the debates that were ongoing in the past. Should Zambia be a Christian nation or not? Well, Zambia had already been declared a Christian nation. And so what I needed to deal with was, how does the church then relate to this state that already proclaims as a Christian nation? I think that is one of the important historical elements that inform my study. How should the church relate to the state that declares itself Christian? And so this study was literature review study. And so it is informed out of extensive review of history, of politics, of theology as well. And it goes into it utilizes mostly the African story, the fact that we need to tell our stories in the ways that explain the world around us and the theology around us. So that is the methodology that we use. In terms of the practical theology methodology, we use the osmas. Now that can be seen in chapter 1, and I will not go into details of the boring stuff. So how does a church then relate to the state that has declared itself a Christian nation? Now, the reason why we have to look at it from the evangelical perspective is several. First of all, most of the studies that were done to study the church and state relationships in Zambia were done from the perspective, for example, of the Catholic Church. And one of the most important studies in this case was done by the current Archbishop of Lusaka, Archbishop Alec Banda. He studied on his PhD in Germany was on church and state relations from a Catholic perspective. And then another Anglican priest also studied from the Anglican perspective. And so there was definitely need to bring an evangelical perspective. Now, evangelicalism in Zambia is wide. And that's why one of the things that this book does is to try and appreciate the broader perspective of evangelical theology and evangelicals in Zambia, but also single out a particular stream of evangelicals in Zambia, the Pentecostals. And so that is the perspective. So it's evangelical in terms of its wide application, but we are also singling out the Pentecostals charismatics. And I decided to combine the definition of Pentecostal and charismatics because in Zambia, this movement is regarded as very similar characteristics. And so then, if we are to go into the book, I explore the history. Now, most of the models that were used to explain the relationship between church and state, most of them were either borrowed from sociology, or in some cases they were borrowed from the typologies from the West. And those typologies looked at which one was more powerful between church and state. And some of them looked at how you can control which one is much more powerful or controlling the other. I realized that the study has shown that those are inadequate to explain, particularly the Zambian situation. And therefore, we must approach the Zambian situation in a different way. And so when we went back into history, this study does show that church and state relations in Zambia, or the relationship between politics and religion, go beyond the coming of the missionaries into Zambia. And so, in order for us to find how pre-Christian Zambians relate to church and state, we had to go to the history and to look at how particular tribes are relating between their particular religion and the political entities. And so then I develop from that particular history, we then build on that until we come to the declaration of Zambia as a Christian nation, and then we finally come to the evangelical attitudes. And then we then ask ourselves to say, how then should this evangelical church relate to a state that has declared itself as a Christian state? Several things stand out, and I would like to point that out. First of all, in the African traditional religious worldview, and I think this is what most of scholars of African traditional religions agree with, is the fact that in the African traditional religious worldview, there isn't a distinction between the sacred and the secular. Between the temporal and the sacred. That is the way the African worldview is predominantly viewed by scholars. And so from the African religious worldview, religion is there to answer to temporal needs, to current realities. And the intervention of God is sought to make life better. Africans appeal to ancestors and ancestral spirits to make our current lives better. And in fact, when people become ancestors, they become ancestors and they are spoken of in terms of how they are affecting current life. And so that is very important to understand in that context. When missionaries come, my study suggests that when missionaries appear in the Zambian context, they bring a very different message. And the message that they bring is, there is a distinction between the sacred and the secular. As a matter of fact, you are living here on earth, but the real reward is going to be somewhere in heaven. That is the principal message that missionaries are bringing to Zambians. Nevertheless, the missionaries' own behavior actually is a contradiction, in the sense that as they are teaching heaven, and as they are teaching that we are living here on earth in order to go to heaven, and they are preaching that Jesus is our savior in order to go to heaven, that messaging is contradicted, first of all, by the missionaries' own temporality, their own lives. And so what is happening among the natives is that they see that the missionaries, therefore, are a continuation of African traditional religious worldview, not a radical stop to the African traditional religious worldview. In other words, then, even as the message is being preached about heaven, the missionaries are, in fact, helping the African to go to school. And school definitely is not there to help people go to heaven. School is to help the Africans receive an education to make their lives better here on earth. Missionaries are investing in health. And of course, why would you need health in order to have a better life here on earth? And so that message is resonating among the Africans. And so that message of a distinction between church and state that the missionaries came with from Europe when they come into Africa is no longer, that's not the message that is being received by the Zambians. Therefore, when, for example, the missionaries finally set up their mission stations, the mission stations become states. And the missionaries themselves now begin defending the tribes that they had converted to Christianity. They begin using guns, and in some cases, they become the precursors of colonialism. And so, on one hand, there is this message of sacred and secular, a clear distinction of sacred and secular. On the other hand, there is the practice that is contradicting the message. Nevertheless, a lot of people in Zambia are converted, they become Christian, and one of those converts is a Malawan, in Nyasaland at that moment, from Nyasaland, and he receives the message and he becomes an evangelist. And then he moves from Malawi and he travels westwards to Chinsali, settles there, and his name is David Kaunda, Reverend David Kaunda. When he settles there, he establishes one of the earliest mission stations that that are African initiated and planted. So Reverend David Kaunda plants a church in Chinsali, a few hundred kilometers from his home in Livingstonia Mission. And Chinsali, that church becomes the birthplace of Kenneth David Kaunda, and Kenneth David Kaunda becomes Zambia's first president. Nevertheless, Kenneth Kaunda's outlook is still very much informed by Christian, is very much informed by missionaries, and up to a point where now Zambia mostly becomes a Christian nation. And after it becomes a Christian nation, due to, of course, a lot more intervention from evangelicals and Pentecostals, we have the coming in of President Frederick Chiluba, who was a member of the United Church of Zambia, but whose theology was very Pentecostal charismatic. He declares Zambia as a Christian nation. And of course, the Pentecostals feel like it's our time now. This is our government, and we've got to govern the nation in the way that the Bible dictates. So they meet up with Frederick Chiluba and they tell him, you've got to appoint us as ministers, you've got to appoint us as ambassadors, you've got to rule this country according to the Bible. And for one reason or another, the perspective towards the Bible is very evangelical, of course. So they go to the textual interpretation of the Bible. What does the Bible say? And that is what they want to see happening in Zambia. And so this is where now the issue comes in. If Zambia is a Christian nation, quite all right, but it adheres to a secular constitution and it guarantees freedom of religion for every citizen, how do you then reconcile these two? You are a Christian nation, but you're also a nation of other religions. How are you going to actually make it work? And so therefore my book then goes to solutions. And one of the solutions is that the church must be hospitable. And even Christians that are in government must have an attitude of hospitality towards the other. And we need to accept that even if Zambia is a Christian nation, indeed, it is a secular nation. And so the tension will exist where Zambia is a Christian nation by constitution, but it is actually secular by law and by practice. How does the church then live? There's got to be a theology of hospitality. The idea that even if you as a church are in power, this nation is not a church. It is still a nation that must respect the religious freedoms of others, including non-Christians. And of course, the theology of hospitality that I'm proposing in this book is extended not only to other religions, but also to the different sects in Zambia. Because Zambia has Catholics and Protestants, and within Protestants, there are so many other groups. And one of the things that I think are going to follow, and I challenge other theologians that could be listening, is to see how now the Seventh-day Adventists as well, how Seventh-day theology is playing out with the current government, which is predominantly Seventh-day Adventist, beginning from our head of state to a good number of members of parliament and even councils, very predominantly Seventh-day Adventists. Perhaps that could be a future focus of attention. One of the other things that this study exposes also is the idea that the Christian nation and particularly Pentecostalism, Pentecostalism is a continuation of African traditional religious worldviews. It does not introduce something new into Zambia's religious framework. It continues African traditional religious worldviews. If indeed the messages of the missionaries and David Kaunda's churches and that group of missionaries that planted a church in Zambia, if their attitude was, we need to stop the African traditional religious worldview and introduce a whole complete new faith, Pentecostalism has actually gone back to African traditional religious worldviews, because in Pentecostalism, God exists to do exactly what the African God must do. That is to stop suffering, to bring government under God, and to intervene, to have the Spirit intervene into the temporal affairs. And Pentecostal charismatics right now, the fact that God is a God of prosperity, that is a predominantly African religious worldview, that God is a God of prosperity, not of suffering at all. There is no tolerance for suffering, and that is what Pentecostalism has introduced into Zambian outlook. And so, to the extent that it informs the state in Zambia, the political players in Zambia that adhere to the Pentecostal faith, they also give out that message. The idea that God is there to bless our country. And so we must invite the providence of God to be with us and bless us. And if we don't do what the gods want to do, what God wants to do, we are going to suffer greatly. And so that, in a nutshell, is what this book is all about.
Well, thank you very much. Obviously, lots of very interesting themes to explore there. So I will invite you, if you have questions, to please put them in the Q&A. The chat is disabled for all of you, so I encourage you to ask your questions in the Q&A, and you can, go ahead and start doing that. You don't have to wait for the Q&A time. Well, we have Dr. Ashagri Abdi, who is going to give a response to Dr. Munshya's introduction. Dr. Abdi is originally from Ethiopia, but spent the last 15 years in the US. He is a trained international human rights lawyer with a Master's of Laws from Northwestern University School of Law and a PhD in Peace and Conflict Studies from George Mason University. For over a decade, he has worked extensively on human rights, conflicts, and religion, focusing on sub-Saharan Africa. He has considerable experience, both academic and practical, in state-church relationships and the role of religion in conflict and conflict resolution. He has extensively traveled across Africa, conducting research on conflict and freedom of religion, governance, and election monitoring. Additionally, he's provided training on conflict resolution, human rights, and other pertinent topics. Obviously well qualified to give a response. So over to you, Dr. Abdi.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here to comment on the book. I like Zambia. I've been to Zambia, very quiet, nice country where I want to spend probably sometime in the future. At the same time, the author is also, my alumni. So I don't know how this dynamics going to work.
Yeah.
We're the product of Northwestern School of Law. Very fascinating book. Most of the time, people ignore some very important things about church and the state, but this book really met it head on. For me, it is a very comprehensive and insightful examination of the dynamic interplay between religious institutions, and the political authority in Zambia. Through meticulous historical analysis, theological reflection, and the practical recommendations, the author offers a detailed narrative that illuminates the complex relationship between the church and the state. This book is particularly valuable for its examples and applications for how evangelicals should navigate their public engagement, making it crucial read for scholars, religious leaders, and the policymakers alike. The author begins by tracing the historical evolution of church-state relations in Zambia, providing a rich context that spans from the pre-colonial era through the colonial period to the present day. As we know, most of the books, when they deal with church and the state relationship in Africa, they often ignore the role of ATR in the African political discourse. So this, for me, is also a shift in that aspect. The author highlights the pivotal role that African traditional religions played in legitimizing political authority and maintaining social order before the advent of Christianity in Africa. The colonial period introduced new dynamics as Christian missionaries became influential intermediaries between the colonial administration and the indigenous population, laying the groundwork for the complex church-state relationship that persists today. This historical perspective is essential for understanding the roots of contemporary issue and the continuity of certain themes in Zambian society. A significant portion of the book is dedicated to the theological analysis, where the author draws extensively from both Old and New Testament scriptures to develop a framework for church-state relations. He contrasts the theocratic models of the Old Testament, where religious and the political powers were often united, with the teaching of Jesus and the apostles, who advocated for a balanced separation of church and the state. This theological groundwork provides a robust basis for evangelicals to understand their role in governance and the public life, emphasizing that while the church must engage with the state, it must also maintain its prophetic independence and integrity. As someone who is working on freedom of religion in sub-Saharan Africa, I found this very interesting because I have to deal with countries where one religion is declared a state religion, and then the others are considered second-class groups. One of the most critical aspects in Zambia's church-state history, President Frederick Chiluba's declaration of Zambia as a Christian nation, is thoroughly examined in this book. The author delves into the motivations, implications, and the reactions to this declaration, offering a balanced view that acknowledges both its potential benefits and the inherent risks. He explains how the declaration aimed at embedding Christian values into the nation's identity and the governance, but also brought about significant challenges, particularly concerning religious tolerance and the risk of political co-optation of religious sentiments. This analysis is crucial for understanding the balanced landscape of church-state in Zambia and the ongoing debates surrounding this declaration. Other countries also can learn from this book and consider their approach. Another very interesting aspect of the book is the author's intention of exploring and finding the intention and the personal belief of the policymakers, in this case, the presidents. Munshya's work also highlights how personal beliefs and the convictions of political leaders significantly influence constitutional development. President Chiluba's declaration of Zambia as Christian nation is a prime example of how personal religious beliefs can shape national policy and the constitutional frameworks. This decision was deeply rooted, possibly, in Chiluba's evangelical faith and his vision of integrating Christian principles into the fabric of national governance. This book provides a detailed account of how such personal convictions can drive legislative change and affect the interpretation and application of constitutional laws. Furthermore, the author explores how these beliefs can extend beyond domestic policy to influence foreign policy and the national agendas, highlighting the profound impact that personal faith can have on the broader social political landscape. The book also provides a practical guidelines for evangelicals by giving an extensive guidelines for how evangelicals should conduct themselves in the public sphere. The book also tries to address the critical issue of interfaith relations in multi-religious society like Zambia. The author emphasizes the importance of tolerance and accommodation, arguing that the state must protect the religious freedom of all its citizens while also maintaining its Christian identity. As I said earlier, one of the issues when it comes to freedom of religion is that the religion that is already declared the state religion, it has a preferential treatment, making others work difficult in terms of access to resources like state media and other resources and even protection. He suggests that fostering dialogue and the cooperation between various religious groups is essential for building mutual understanding and respect. This approach not only helps in promoting social cohesion, but also ensures that the evangelical church can contribute positively to national development without alienating other faith communities. While Dr. Munshya's book is rich in local context and analysis, it would have greatly benefited from incorporating a comparative study of church-state relations in other African countries. For example, examining the historical relationship between the Ethiopian state and the Orthodox Church, where Christianity was the state religion for over 700 years until 1974, could provide valuable insights. Such a comparison would highlight different models of church-state relations and offers lessons on the potential benefits and the pitfalls of close church-state ties, including a chapter dedicated to comparative analysis, would enrich the book's narrative and provide a broader perspective on the subject. The author also challenges the Eurocentric view about the state's church relationship in Africa. Most of these authors actually start from the colonial period, while the state church relationship in Africa goes back more than that. Remember, we believe that Africa is the land of origins, so we can trace back more than that. This book adheres to its purpose by clearly defining its methodology and addressing the fundamental questions it set out to answer. Another fundamental aspect of this book is not only its excellent examples where religion profoundly impacts politics, but also the author's intriguing exploration of how individuals, policymakers, and the presidents, their beliefs and the religious affiliation influenced the supreme law of the land, state apparatus, including the army, and even the purpose of having national holidays. Of course, neither the author nor anyone else can fully discern whether these decision makers were using the church to gain support, acting out of personal conviction, or a combination of both. Only those presidents or individuals themselves would be able to tell that. In conclusion, church and the state relations in Zambia, an Evangelical Perspective by Dr. Elias Munshya is a scholarly work and offers extensive examples and the practical implications for understanding and navigating church-state relations. The author's historical depth, theological rigor, and the practical recommendations make this book an indispensable resource for anyone interested in the intersection of religion and the politics in Zambia. As the author mentioned now, the president and a significant number of his cabinets are Seventh-day Adventists, and this might even be another area where this book can help, especially even those who are empowering Zambia. The book's emphasis on tolerance, civic engagement, and ethical governance provides a comprehensive guide for evangelicals and other religious communities to engage constructively with the state, fostering a society that respects and celebrates religious diversity while promoting the common good. Incorporating comparative studies in the future editions could further enhance its value by providing broader context and lessons from other historical and contemporary examples. For me as a reader and an expert on freedom of religion in the African context, this book is very fascinating, scholarly written, and I would like to thank the author for this job very well done. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that helpful and interesting response, given your broad context of looking at many different countries in Africa and issues of church-state relations. Well, I now would like to introduce Dr. Kyle Wisdom, who may provide some response, but take us into the Q&A session. And I do see that people have been putting their questions on the Q&A. Thank you for that, and please continue to do so. Dr. Kyle Wisdom is the Deputy Director of the International Institute for Religious Freedom. He's an alumnus of Middlesex University and the Oxford Center for Mission Studies. His research has been focused on the interplay between religion and the state, particularly focused in Indonesia, where he lived for over a decade. But obviously that provides an interesting contrast of a country that is a Muslim country, but a hospitable and open Muslim country. Dr. Wisdom is also a lead researcher on the project of good practices to reduce, resolve, and prevent religious conflict. This is an effort to research and publicize helpful practices being successfully used in many parts of the world. He is also involved in several interfaith projects and consulting with government and policymakers, so obviously well engaged with these topics as well. He lives and works in the US. So over to you, Kyle. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. And thank you, Ambassador Munshya, so much for your presentation, for the work that you've done, and for your ongoing service. I'll just briefly comment that there were some interesting parallels for me. I've a growing sense of knowledge in church-state relations in Africa, but spent a lot of my time in research in Asia. And as Dr. Buckingham has mentioned, Indonesia also declares itself a country founded on the belief in God. Although they interpret it slightly differently, they use kind of a broad word of God, not necessarily an Islamic term, although it's a Muslim majority country. And they too wrestle with tensions for how to promote pluralism while also seeking to honor the majority, and perhaps give preferential treatment to different Muslim groups. While at the same time, there's diversity within Islam, just as there is diversity within Christianity. And I think some of that diversity just below the surface can perhaps obscure some of the challenges to support kind of a robust pluralism in a modern nation state. I have a couple questions, and then I want to kind of pivot into some of the questions that we've been having into the chat. Again, please put any questions in the Q&A box that's available on the bottom menu bar. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can during the time that we have. Your Eminence, you conducted this research and worked on this project while you were living in Canada and functioning in a certain capacity, both as a lawyer and as a Christian. And now you have a different role. You are on a different, not side of the fence, especially in the Zambian context, but a different sort of seat at the table. And now you're more rooted in the political space. I'm curious if you could reflect a little bit on how sitting in this seat may have impacted your perspective on the work. Has it changed it? Has it informed it? Has it enriched it? What kind of things have you noticed and thought about since taking on this new position?
I do think that my studies prepared me for this role, because even if I am a Pentecostal preacher, my study, on the other hand, made me appreciate both religious and political pluralism. And I think that's what this study has gotten. And so in my role as Zambia's High Commissioner, I am representing a state that has declared itself a Christian nation, and yet a state that is also secular to the extent that it affords individual Zambians their liberty to worship. And so it is a tension that we must learn to live with, particularly those of us who believe fundamentally in the Bible and believe in being born again, and being confronted with the fact that, yes, even when we are born again, our country is not a church. Our country is a nation and that is the humility with which we must approach our duties. And so, yes, my studies have greatly informed my work, but also my work currently is being informed by both the success and the failures of the fundamentalist Pentecostal perspective to leadership. We Pentecostals have been in power in Zambia, perhaps, and my book explores that, from the Chiluba era. At one point, we had almost like 5 top government executive leaders who belonged to our faith. And we have noticed how, if you don't really adhere to constitutionalism and the rule of law, how that can go downhill very, very fast. And I think that is what is helping me in my role currently as an ambassador. The fact that we are a Christian nation, the fact that we are Christians, does not, and if we are not living the Christian life, if we are not being respectful of our laws, of our constitution, eventually we are going to end up the same way that anyone else ended up. And so that is the humility with which we approach this room.
Thank you.
Without sounding a little bit political, but we need to delve back a little bit. A few years ago, the previous government wanted to introduce a new law in Zambia. So they wanted to change the current constitution, the 2016 constitution, and introduce a new law. And in that law, they were proposing very fundamental shifts, even regarding the Christian nation infrastructure. And we opposed that, and we opposed some of our own fellow Pentecostals to say that, no, you cannot let the state take this kind of route in exchange for the fact that you are going to continue being a Christian nation, or you're going to be more of that Christian nation. I think we need to approach this with a lot more humility, a lot more hospitality towards the other. Because Zambia, or if Zambia was created by God, then God, at the founding of Zambia, has Christians in it and has adherents of African traditional religions. That is how God made it. And if God made it that way, it becomes very difficult for you to go and say, we want the Zambia to be the Christian version of our fundamentalist Pentecostal charismatic approach.
Thank you. I think that kind of reminds me of an offhand comment, or not offhand, but a comment that you made that I wanted to follow up on, that also kind of came up in the questions. You mentioned that Zambia is secular by law and practice, but the government is Christian. Could you, I think you sort of hinted at that in your answer, but perhaps maybe you could make your comment a little bit more explicit.
It's on whether the Christian Nation Declaration confers reliable rights on Zambian Christians. And the most serious thing is that even Pentecostal Christians themselves, evangelical Christians themselves, and Christian leaders have no understanding that the declaration of Zambia as a Christian nation and the constitutionalization of the declaration of Zambia as a Christian nation confers no reliable rights on Christian citizens as opposed to others. It doesn't. For example, as a Christian, I don't have more rights, more religious freedoms than a Muslim in Zambia, under Zambian law. It doesn't. I don't have more access to privileges, state privileges, than a non-Christian. And so, yes, Zambia is a Christian nation, and that's the contradiction we will continue to live with. Zambia is a Christian nation by declaration, but it is also a secular nation. That is the contradiction. And I think I discuss this in my book as well, where, and I know that Dr. Abdi has rightly observed that I perhaps did not go into Ethiopia. I should have, because of the Ethiopia's long history with church and state, and I should have done that. But I think I was much more focused on modern Pentecostal evangelicals in Zambia, that I did not explore that. And I give the example of Nigeria, for example. So if evangelical Pentecostal charismatics in Zambia embrace Zambia to be a Christian nation, and yet Nigerian charismatism is influential in Zambia, and yet Nigerian charismatics would do everything to make Nigeria be a secular state. So the question that I ask fellow Pentecostal evangelicals in Zambia is, if the version of Nigerian Pentecostal charismatism has so much influence in Zambia, how do you then live with this tension where Nigerian Christians would do everything to maintain Nigeria to be a secular state? And yet we in Zambia, we assume that Zambia must be a Christian nation and it can never be a secular state. That is a contradiction. And so the compromise I'm proposing is that, yes, indeed, Zambia is a Christian state, but Zambia is a secular state as well.
Thank you. I think it's such an interesting political context that is perhaps more unique and difficult for those coming from a different political context to really wrap their heads around. But it also makes for quite a fascinating discussion. So thank you very much. I'd like to transition to asking a few more questions from the chat. We'll sort of go through what we can in the next few minutes, and then I'll hand it back over to Dr. Buckingham to wrap us up. One of the questions has to do with the church-state relations and what potential pros and cons or what negative implication could there be for the church to have official recognition from the state?
There are several. First of all, Zambia is not the issue is that there is no one sect of Christianity in Zambia. So when we say that Zambia is a Christian state, it's a very general term. And I think it's up to whoever is in power. It's really left up to whoever is in power. Like right now, if we say that Zambia is a Christian state, if most of the executive, the cabinet and members of parliament in the ruling party are Seventh-day Adventists, a good number of them, is Zambia's Christian nation status Adventist? Can they, for example, promote Adventist theology and outlook on the state? The Sabbath being a very fundamental doctrine of Adventist theology. Can the theology of the Sabbath influence when, for example, Zambia holds its official meetings and Saturdays? What about diet? Would Adventist theology inform it? And so those are the kind of struggles that we have, because Zambia itself, we say that we are Christian, we are a Christian nation, but we belong to a lot more denominations. And there is no consensus on a political theology. Archbishop Dr. Alec Banda's approach was the churches can have hospitals, and in fact, we can create a whole institution that mediates between church and state. That is his proposal in his study. But how is that workable in a nation where you in fact have several other denominations? And so Christianity, therefore, in Zambia becomes cultural Christianity, where we all say that we are really Christian, but we do not tie it to any particular denomination. So those are some of the struggles that we will continue having as a Christian state. And the fact that the political, the ruling parties in Zambia, they play around the churches. So some of the previous governments were very amenable to Pentecostals. Mostly they were Pentecostals. Do Pentecostals still have influence now? My argument is not really. The vice president is a Pentecostal preacher. She is a ordained Pentecostal reverend, and her husband and she herself runs a particular church. But other than that, you do have lots of evangelical or lots of Adventist theology and to some extent Catholicism. those are kind of some struggles that we face if we are to say that Zambia is going to be a Christian state completely. Nevertheless, one other aspect we need to look at is that when you look at Christianity in Zambia and the fact that it confers no reliable rights on Zambians, and we contrast the Zambian situation with the British situation, for example, as a matter of fact, Christianity is more entrenched in the state symbols in Britain than they are in Zambia. Mm. And so the contradiction that we experience in Zambia is in fact at a very much higher level in England, because the king of Great Britain is also the defender of the faith. And it's not the faiths, it's a particular denomination that the king defends. The House of Lords has seats that are reserved for a particular denomination. When a king is being enthroned, there is a particular rights that are very, very fundamental to a particular religious denomination. So in that case, then England, Britain, the United Kingdom is far much more entrenched with the Church of England than Zambia is entrenched with any denomination in Zambia. So the two can coexist. So a state which is fundamentally Anglican can also provide religious freedom to its citizens. And that is the UK example that we have. In Zambia, a state that has declared itself as a Christian nation in a general term without a denominational specificity can afford religious liberty to its citizens.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful and a good comparison. At the International Institute for Religious Freedom, one of our main driving passions and research interests is the issue of religious freedom. And I don't think I could move on without asking some kind of question about that. I did some research from the World Religions Database and the World Christian Database, and the demographical breakdown from the research I've done has Christians at 86% of the entire population, ethno-religionists, or that's their term for African traditional religions, at 10%. And then we have Baha'is, which would be the third largest, according to the research, at 2.8%, 2.3%. And then Muslims after that, the next largest at less than 1%, 0.9%. So still a largely majority Christian, 86% of the population is Christian. And yet within the Christians, there are a pretty even breakdown between Catholics at 37% and Protestants at 39% and independents at 18%. So the Christian bloc, although 86% is not monolithic, and the other religious minorities, with Baha'i being one of the more open-minded, kind of coexistent, peaceable, tolerant groups, and then Muslims at less than 1%. How could you speak a little bit to the issue of religious freedom in a context such as this? And I think of particular interest is the sense in which some religious minorities might move towards extremism, as is happening significantly in West Africa. What do you observe about religious freedom in Zambia? What do you think might be unique or specific to your context? And how does that relate to some of the majority and minority dynamics?
Yeah, in terms of law, Zambia protects religious minorities as a matter of law. And my book deals with some instances where, due to protests in Zambia, a government would ban a particular denomination. and in almost all instances, the courts have pushed back against such government actions, be it some Muslims, or in some instances, a sect of Christianity, known as the Universal Church. I have discussed it in my book. And the Universal Church had been banned by the Zambian state on several occasions. And on each of those occasions, the courts pushed back and said, you can't ban a church after you've registered it, and not for the reasons that they were advancing. In terms of religious extremism, I think Zambia should be quite low on that, because Zambia is very, very fundamentally Christian. There is a lot of arguments about that. I would say that Zambia is fundamentally African traditional religious worldviews, and lots of syncretism between African traditional religious practices and Christianity. If there is a new religion that we founded, maybe that is the case. But yes, we do not. I do not foresee a situation where we could have religious extremism, or of the extent of other countries. Islam is not very developed in Zambia. In fact, however, we do have Muslims in our government. And in fact, one of my colleagues, ambassadors, is a Muslim, and he's a Zambian just like everyone else. And sometimes he even pushes back when we are assuming, or when we get taken by the idea that we are only Christians. So he checks back and says, "Oh no, but I'm a Muslim, and we are in this together. We are all citizens." And that's what we are. I think we will continue being a very peaceful country from the way it looks. We are very open to different shades of Christianity. The Catholic Church will continue being very influential. Pentecostals are also growing because of their attitude towards prosperity and a good life. And myself, having come from that background, I see the benefits of that background. The word of faith movement, the you can do it attitude towards Christianity, it is likely to continue being very influential in Zambia. The declaration as a Christian nation, in fact, was part of the currents that are leading to the declaration of Zambia as a Christian nation. Kenneth Kaunda, when Kenneth Kaunda becomes president, he's a Christian. He is a member of the United Church of Zambia. As a matter of fact, he presides over the establishment of the United Church of Zambia. Nevertheless, in about the 70s, Kenneth Kaunda begins changing. He becomes much more sympathetic to Eastern mysticism. And when he is doing that, the born-again movement is rising. And so Kaunda then gets cast in this rhetoric of the fact that he's not a Christian. He has abandoned God, and the evangelicals rise. And some of the evangelical leaders, as they are rising, they are fundamentally proposing that Zambia should be a Christian nation so as to stop the growth of Islam. Now, imagine in the 80s, Islam is still has not grown, but Dr. Nevas Mumba, Dr. Imakando, and several other Pentecostal charismatics, they are agitating for the declaration of Zambia as a Christian nation in order to stop the growth of Islam. And then the declaration comes in 1991. Did the declaration stem the growth of Islam? Maybe another person can explore that. But since then, Islam has remained has not grown fundamentally, and I think those figures are accurate. But there are some indications that it is growing at the moment, but we'll see to that, yeah.
Thank
So
you.
am I allowed to ask Kyle here just one quick? I might leave because I have another meeting coming up. Sorry.
Did you have a question then?
It is just a follow-up. I think the ambassador answered one question, whether the fact that the constitution declares Zambia as a Christian nation, whether that would add to any substantive rights for Christians. The answer was, I think, a definitive no. But the follow-up question is, how about shaping the value in the society? Holidays. Now, for example, if we go to the US, we celebrate Christmas, but we don't celebrate others. But the United States is not it's not a Christian nation. Constitutionally, there is a firewall. So that is how it is shaping the value in the society, in the education system, and all those kind of things. That is one question. The second question, I tried to indicate in my review, where I said, whether those politicians, be it Kaunda or Chulubo and others, whether they really wanted to make Zambia as a Christian nation, or whether it was a political expediency. So that I realized you tried to go through that process, but as I said, probably nobody knows, but I would like to see your reflection on that. Thank you, Kyle.
Oh, yes. So when it comes to the culture, Zambian culture still remains fundamentally Christian. And in that case, then, even when we say that it does not confer reliable rights, I meant rights that you can actually take to court. Nevertheless, and I know, Dr. Abdi, we can continue engaging in these questions. But yes, Zambian culture is primarily Christian. The values now, one of the things that the Constitution 2016 does is that it has come up with a framework of values. And most of those values are actually framed within Christianity and ethics. One of the issues in Zambia is that Zambian Christians actually, when it is convenient, we like saying that African and Christian values are the same. Values of respect, values of honor, marriage. We like doing that. On the other hand, we like saying that there is a fundamental difference between African values and Christianity, for example. But in that case, then, yes, it's fundamentally Christian. There could be some arguments that can be had about the extent of that Christianity. But yes, we have Christmas. We have 3 days of Easter, Friday, Saturday, and Monday. Nobody can touch that. We have National Prayer Day, and this National Prayer Day is predominantly Christian. National Prayer Day of Fasting and Reconciliation. It's predominantly Christian. And even me here as an ambassador, I lead in those prayers. I invite pastors mainly to preside over those meetings. Our uniformed forces, they mostly adhere to Christianity. I'm yet to learn of a Muslim chaplain at the moment, but I'll have to check my records and see if we do have, in fact, a Muslim or a Hindu chaplain. But most of the chaplaincy right now is mostly Christian on reliable rights. On whether the declaration of Zambia as a Christian nation was done for political favor, I think it's both. Because President Frederick Chiluba declares Zambia as a Christian nation in 1991, very early on in his presidency. And he does it to the cheers of a lot of Pentecostal charismatics. And the first thing that the Catholics do is to praise the declaration. They never differed with it. Catholics had issues with the declaration far much later in the history, and that's what my book demonstrates as well. They became far much more hostile towards the declaration far much later. I think when they saw how Frederick Chiluba, in their opinion, was governing the nation. But yes, so it's both. It's both, I think, to give themselves as ordained by God, that it's God who has given them political and temporal powers, and also to receive some political mileage from the electorate who are predominantly a Christian, or they receive a Christian in better light than a non-Christian.
Thank you, Dr. Munshya. I just have one last question, I think. Thank you so much for your time. I know here in Australia, it's getting late, even as those of us perhaps further west are just getting going with our day. But I think this question really gets to some of the heart of what you stated for your book, which is the issue of religious hospitality. So someone has asked, how should the evangelical church in Zambia relate to other growing non-Christian groups? And how will this relate to the opposing Islamic worldview of religious dominance in Zambia? How can the church in Zambia engage in these other views by extending religious hospitality?
All right. So it's religious hospitality mainly towards the attitude towards the state and state political power. It is not religious tolerance towards the competition that is taking place within the evangelicals and non-evangelicals in Zambia. The state must give freedom to religions to compete and to evangelize freely among themselves. The issue comes in where the evangelical has political power, where the evangelical church or perceives itself to have political power, and to use that power to mistreat religious minorities. That is where now hospitality comes in, and the theology of humility. Because there's been instances where some evangelical Pentecostal charismatic pastors have been telling the state to say, ban this church, or ban this sect is satanic, ban it. And yeah, that's where I'm saying the evangelical church can't do that in looking at the state. Nevertheless, the evangelical church is free to evangelize and free to call satanic whoever they want to call satanic, except that they can do that in their daily work as evangelists, as missionaries in their own nation. And I think they need to continue doing that. And the state must continue to remain neutral and guarantee to every citizen in Zambia their rights to follow the religion of their choice.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. And I'd like to hand it back over to Dr. Buckingham.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much, Dr. Munshya, for writing this book, for doing this study. No question, writing a doctoral dissertation at the same time that you're running a law practice and doing some pastoral work is an incredible feat. You obviously have a lot of capacity, but we also appreciate the thought that has gone behind that. And so thank you very much for writing this book. Thank you very much, Dr. Abdi and Dr. Wisdom, for your contribution to the book launch. And for those of you who have not read the book and are now intrigued and really want to see what is in it, it is available for download at IIRF.global. That is the website for the International Institute for Religious Freedom. You'll also find some other interesting books there, but this book is at the top of the list. It is the latest publication, and I encourage you to. It covers obviously a lot more than we can cover in a book launch. So please do go download it and read it, and thank you for your interest and for joining us for this webinar today.
And the paper versions of the books.
Yes, the paper versions of the books, Marcella, do you know where they are available? It is printed. Is it available? I know it's available on Amazon in Germany, but I'm not sure if it's available on Amazon in other places, but it may well be for those who like to read actual books as opposed to downloading something from a website.
Yes,
Marcella, yeah, sorry.
yes, we're in process to make it able to be buy by the Amazon International, but in the meanwhile, you can when you access to the PDF format, you can see the contact of the publisher, so you can contact them and they will find a way to send you the print versions. But for now, it's able to be sold through Amazon.de from Germany.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, that concludes our time together today. And so thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.